Hey everybody, it's Allison with the Everyday Scrapbooker, and I'm dropping in today to share with you a Halloween inspired card that I made using close to my heart's Frightful Friends. I figured I had a perfect opportunity to use up some scrap papers to create this card, so I dove into my scrap paper box and pulled out the polka dot pattern paper. I trimmed it to roughly 4 inches by 5 1/4, and then I matted it behind black cardstock as well. And then I went and found some scrap toffee cardstock and trimmed that to 3 3/4 by 5 inches. You'll see as I create, I don't adhere everything together right off the bat. I like to lay them all next to each other on top of each other and just play around with the design and see how I feel about things before I actually commit to it. And that goes the same for any of the images that I stamp and fussy cut out or anything else that goes on my cards. I added a couple other strips of plain black cardstock. I trimmed them to 1/4 inch by 4 1/4 so that it would span the entire card, and just laid them over the top just to see how I felt about it. Next, I took the owl from the Frightful Friends stamp set, stamped it in intense black ink on white daisy cardstock, that scraps as well, and then colored it in with the new Spectrum Noir markers. To fill in the owl's body, I used the Earth Brown Blend marker, and I used the lightest shade in the marker to fill in its entire body. And then to fill in some of the shadowing and where shadows would be, I used the medium color in the middle of the pen to do that. So where the feathers are on the owl's chest, I highlighted that with the medium brown color from the marker, and then shadowing in its face and the rest of the body as well. Just a little tip to keep in mind when you are coloring, if you're trying to figure out what color it is that you want to use and you haven't totally decided yet, I like to use the space just above any image that I have stamped and just scribble a little bit of the color and decide what I like the best. To color in the buckle on the witch's hat, originally I was going to go with the gold color, but I felt like it was too much brown, so I ended up going with purple instead. So I colored or scribbled just a couple of different colors in purple and figured out which one I liked the best and stuck with that. I wanted to add some color to the broom as well because I didn't want it to stay all black. So I took a sponge dauber that I had previously used before. I like to label all of my sponge daubers with a label maker so that I know what color I use. So the next time I go to use that particular sponge dauber, it's already marked and I don't end up mixing colors. So I took my almond sponge dauber, filled it up with almond ink, and just filled in the bottom portion of the broom there. And as you can see, I wasn't done with sponging just yet. I took my more sponge daubers and filled it up with lilac, glacier, and pebble inks and created a night sky on the small stitch circle thin cut. That's the circle there that you see. To hold the circle in place while I was doing my inking, I used just a little bit of washi tape just to adhere it to my work surface so that I wouldn't have to hold it with my fingers and get my fingers in the way while I was trying to ink the background. I couldn't decide while I was creating this card whether I wanted to use the medium stitch circle thin cut or the large one. So I started with the medium one, cut it out and inked it, and then placed it on the card background. But I felt when I got the owl laying on top of it that it was too small, so I decided to go back and cut the large one. Before I did that though, I adhered all the background papers together because I was happy with the way that it looked, and the strips of black cardstock as well. To help me keep the little strips of cardstock straight when I put them onto the card mat, I turned the mat on its side, found a line on the Versa mat to line it up with, and left 1/4 inch between each of the strips just to keep them even and neat. So this is where you can see I had changed my mind on the size of the stitch circle thin cut that I wanted to use. I went back and cut the large one and then inked it as well. And then just to see how it felt on the card, I laid it on the card base with the owl on top. And then started placing other stamps around it too, because I was thinking ahead to how I wanted to complete the card. At this point, I felt that the two black cardstock strips were a little bit too far down on the card. So I took them off and repositioned them just a little bit higher on the card mat. And then went and took my adhesive eraser just to kind of pick up the little bits of adhesive that were left behind from where it had originally been glued. Next, I took the large thin cut circle that I had cut and inked and adhered it just with some tape, and then used my foam dots to adhere the owl on top of it just to give it some depth as well. And after I had moved the strips up and the circle that I'd cut, there was a lot more room to add the Happy Halloween at the bottom of the card and a couple of embellishments with the star and the moon. I've gotten into the habit of putting my card mat together before I actually adhere it to the card base, just because, like I said at the beginning of the video, I like to play around with the placement and where things go before I actually commit to it. I want to be 100% certain with where I'm putting things on the card and where I'm stamping them before I actually commit to it, just to be sure that I'm happy with it. Before stamping Happy Halloween on the card base, I put the Halloween stamp on my Versa mat and used the lines on that to line up the stamp as well, just to be sure that it was straight. I did the same with Happy as well. And you'll notice I went back over Halloween because when I stamped it, because I stamped over onto a different paper, there was a little bit of a blip there and it wasn't totally filled in. All I did was took a journaling pen, a black journaling pen, and just colored in the places that didn't get filled with ink. Once I got Happy Halloween stamped to the card base, I went and took some scrap white DZ cardstock and stamped the moon and the star using canary ink. And then I fussy cut them out. There are no thin cuts that goes along with the moon and the star in the stamp set. The only images in Frightful Friends that has thin cuts that goes with it are the characters. So that's the pirate, that's the owl, witch, the mummy, and the vampire. Everything else in the stamp set is up to you to either fussy cut or just stamp directly onto paper. I had no issues cutting out the star, but when I got to the moon, I had some trouble trying to cut it out. I think it's because the image was so small and my eagle talon nails were a little too long, so it made cutting the image just kind of hard. When the moon and the star was cut out finally, I moved them around the card base, just around the owl, until I was happy with where they were placed, and then adhered the star with a foam dot and adhered the moon just with some tape from my tape runner. When I got the card mat adhered to the base, I felt like the card was still lacking just a little bit something else, so I decided to take a clear shimmer brush and color in the moon and the star with the clear shimmer brush just to give it a little bit of sparkle. I had a lot of fun creating this card. It's so sweet and cute, but realized as I was creating that instead of using black cardstock strips in the background, I could use clouds instead. So I think you should stay tuned for another video coming up soon using clouds instead of cardstock strips. Thanks for joining me today. If you enjoyed this video, please click subscribe at the bottom of the video and join me again next time. Thanks, guys.